The void of space is rarely silent. It thrums with the ancient, cold calculations of the Intergalactic Council of superior beings. High above the Milky Way, inside a vessel that looked like a jagged diamond forged from dark matter, the fate of 4 billion years of evolution was being decided in seconds. The Council, a grotesque assembly of multi-eyed, tentacled, and energy-based life forms, had just intercepted a piece of space junk known as the Voyager probe. "It's offensive," hissed the Supreme Arbiter, his dozen eyes narrowing as he scanned the golden record attached to the probe. "They sent us songs about love and pictures of trees, yet their sensors show they are currently detonating nuclear devices for fun and poisoning the very water they need to survive. This species is a Class 5 malignancy, a biological error." The Council rumbled in agreement. To these beings who could move stars like chess pieces, humanity was a virus. However, their ancient constitution, the Galactic Charter, demanded a trial. They could not simply delete a planet without giving its inhabitants a chance to prove they possessed a moral core. "Initiate the standard probationary protocol," the Arbiter commanded. "Select one random inhabitant. Grant them the power of the Source. If they use this absolute power for selfless, noble, and universal good, we spare the planet. If they use it for vanity, destruction, or chaos, Earth will be vaporized before their next sunrise." The Council's energy beams swept across the rotating blue marble of Earth, ignoring kings, presidents, and geniuses. It was looking for the ultimate average human. It found Neil Clarke. Neil was currently in the middle of his own personal disaster in a cramped, drafty flat in London. He was a secondary school teacher who had long ago lost the battle for his students' respect. His morning started with a face-to-face confrontation with a broken boiler that refused to provide hot water, and a dog named Dennis who had decided that Neil's only pair of work shoes looked like a 5-course meal. "I'm late, Dennis. Stop eating the leather," Neil groaned, hopping on one foot as he tried to find a matching sock. He looked at the leaking ceiling, the piles of ungraded papers, and the reflection of a man who looked like he had been defeated by life before the sun had even fully risen. "I just wish I could catch a break." "One break. That's all I ask." He didn't see the flash of golden light that tore through his ceiling. He didn't feel the subatomic restructuring of his DNA. But as he hurried to school, the universe was already listening to his every whim. The classroom was a war zone. 30 teenagers were shouting, throwing paper, and ignoring Neil's desperate pleas for order. One student, a particularly loud bully, stood on a desk, mocking Neil's tie. "I wish you'd just vanish," Neil shouted in a moment of pure, unadulterated frustration, waving his hand toward the back row of the class. "I wish you all would just disappear so I could hear myself think." There was no sound, no explosion, just a sudden, terrifying absence. The 4 boys in the back row simply ceased to exist. Their chairs were empty. The air where they had been standing rippled for a fraction of a second and then went still. The classroom fell into a silence so heavy it felt like lead. Neil's eyes bulged. He looked at his hand. It felt warm, almost humming. Where did they go?" a girl whispered, her voice trembling. Neil realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that he had done it. Or something had. Panic, sharp and cold, flooded his chest. "I didn't mean it. I wish they were back. Right now. Back in their seats, exactly as they were." Snap. The boys reappeared, falling onto their chairs with cries of confusion. They looked shaken, blinking as if they had just been pulled from a dark void. Neil didn't wait to explain. He grabbed his coat and ran, his heart thumping against his ribs. He sprinted all the way back to his flat, locking the door behind him and sliding down to the floor. "It's a stroke," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm having a massive hallucinatory stroke." He looked at the broken light bulb in his hallway. He tentatively raised his right hand and made a small, waving gesture. "I wish that light would fix itself." The bulb didn't just turn on. It glowed with a brilliant, steady light. Neil's jaw dropped. He turned toward the kitchen where a week's worth of dirty dishes sat in the sink. He felt a strange, intoxicating surge of confidence. He waved his hand again. "Wash yourselves, every single one of you, and put yourselves away." The sink erupted into a frenzy of motion. Plates leaped into the air, dancing under the faucet. The sponge scrubbed with a mechanical precision that would have made a professional cleaner weep. The soap suds formed perfect, rhythmic bubbles. Neil watched, a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. He was a god. A clumsy, terrified teacher in a cardigan was holding the power of the universe. He looked down at Dennis. The dog was sitting on the rug, his head tilted, watching a flying saucer return to the cupboard. "Dennis," Neil said, his voice trembling with a mix of awe and mischief. "If I'm a god, I shouldn't be lonely. I want to know what you're thinking. I wish my dog could talk. And I want him to have a voice that's smart, rational, like a gentleman." He pointed his glowing finger at the terrier. Dennis blinked. He licked his nose. Then he sat up straight, his chest puffing out. "To be perfectly honest, Neil," the dog said, his voice a rich, resonant, and incredibly posh baritone that sounded like a Shakespearean actor, "your taste in footwear is absolutely appalling. The leather on those brogues was incredibly chewy, but the aftertaste of foot sweat is something we really need to address. Also, why are you staring at me like I've just grown a second head? It's quite rude." Neil Clarke collapsed onto his sofa, his eyes wide, his world utterly transformed. He was a man with the power to rewrite reality, currently being scolded by his own pet. But high above, in the cold darkness of the diamond ship, the Arbiter's dozen eyes glowed with a predatory light. "He uses the power to speak with a beast," the Arbiter sneered. "The trial of planet Earth is off to a pathetic start. Prepare the sterilization beams. This won't take long." The morning after the Great Awakening was not filled with divine serenity. Neil Clarke woke up with a pounding headache and a talking terrier who refused to stop critiquing the thread count of his bedsheets. In the cold, gray light of London, the events of the previous day felt like a fever dream, until Neil looked at his right hand. It didn't glow anymore, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was bowing in its presence. "Neil, you're sweating again," Dennis remarked from the foot of the bed, his voice as smooth as aged scotch. "It's quite unseemly for a deity. Also, I've been thinking, since you can do absolutely anything, perhaps you could wish for the squirrels in the park to be slower. Or perhaps just more delicious. I find their current agility to be a personal insult to my heritage." Neil ignored him, stumbling into the bathroom. He stared at his reflection. The same pale skin, the same thinning hair, the same tired eyes. "I'm a god," he whispered. "I shouldn't look like a man who struggles with a mortgage." He raised his hand. The golden aura flared. "I wish I had a body that was absolutely perfect. A godlike physique. Peak human condition." The transformation was instantaneous and violent. There was a sickening sound of stretching fabric and creaking floorboards. Neil didn't just get fit, he expanded. He became a mountain of bronzed, pulsating muscle, towering 8 feet tall. His head brushed the ceiling, and his skin began to emit a blinding, radioactive gold luminescence. He looked less like a Greek hero and more like a high-end floor lamp that had been hitting the gym for 1,000 years. "Oh God, no, not like this!" Neil yelled, his voice now a booming bass that rattled the window panes. He could barely lower his arms because his lats were the size of car doors. "I wish I looked like myself, but better. Fit, toned. And for the love of everything, stop the glowing." Snap. He shrank back down. He was still Neil, but his jawline was sharper, his stomach was flat, and his posture was perfect. He exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. He felt incredible. Sharp, focused, and powerful. But the Council in the Stars was already marking his vanity score with a cold, mechanical precision. The subject prioritizes aesthetic self-improvement over planetary stabilization, the Supreme Arbiter noted, his tentacles twitching. Typical. A species obsessed with its own shell while the core rots. Neil, unaware of his failing grades, decided it was time to be a good god. He met his best friend Ray at their local pub. Ray was a man whose heart was permanently bruised by a woman named Rosie, a fellow teacher who viewed him as little more than a piece of office furniture. "Ray, listen to me," Neil said, leaning over a pint of ale that he had secretly wished was the most refreshing liquid in the known universe. "What if I told you that your luck was about to change? What if I told you that Rosie, and every other woman for that matter, was about to find you irresistible?" Neil made a subtle, flicking gesture with his finger under the table. "I wish Ray was the most irresistible man to any woman he meets, especially Rosie." Ray laughed, oblivious. "I'd say you've finally lost it, Neil. I'm a 50-year-old history teacher. I'm about as irresistible as a tax audit." The pub door swung open. A group of women entered, talking and laughing. Then, as if hit by a synchronized lightning strike, they stopped. They turned. Their eyes glazed over with a terrifying, primal intensity as they locked onto Ray. Across the room, Rosie, who was ordering a drink, dropped her glass. The sound of shattering glass was the only noise in the sudden, heavy silence. "Ray?" Rosie whispered, her voice trembling with a hunger that made Neil's skin crawl. "I never noticed the way your ears curve. It's—" Within seconds, the pub was a riot. Women were abandoning their tables, their drinks, and their partners to swarm around a terrified Ray. It wasn't romantic. It was a stampede. Ray was being pulled in 6 different directions, his shirt tearing as women fought to get closer to the irresistible teacher. "Neil, help!" Ray screamed, his face turning pale as he was pinned against the bar. "What did you do?" "Make them stop." Neil panicked. He raised his hand to undo the wish, but his sleeve caught on a stray nail on the bar. As he jerked his arm back, his glowing finger pointed out the window toward the street, where a funeral procession was passing by. His mind, clouded by the chaos and a sudden, misplaced surge of empathy for the grieving families he had seen on the news, made a fatal connection. I wish everyone who ever died was just back," Neil shouted, trying to clear his head and do something big and good to prove he wasn't just a failure. "I wish the dead would just come back to their loved ones." The golden flash was so bright it blinded everyone in the pub for 3 full seconds. Outside, the ground began to heave. In the churchyard 3 blocks away, the manicured grass split open. It wasn't a miracle. It was a catastrophe. Neil had forgotten to specify how they should come back. He hadn't asked for them to be alive, or healthy, or even whole. A scratching sound started at the pub's front door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of bones scraping against wood. "Neil," Dennis said, trotting over to the window and peering out with a look of extreme canine concern. "I don't mean to be a critic, but I think your understanding of happy endings is fundamentally flawed. Also, there's a gentleman in a very dusty tuxedo outside who appears to be trying to eat the mailbox." Neil stood frozen as the screams from the street began to drown out the chaos inside the pub. The open loop had become a noose. The Intergalactic Council of Superior Beings did not possess a sense of humor, but if they did, they would have been howling. On the massive crystalline screens of their flagship, the God of Earth was currently panicking in a pub. To the Council, Neil Clarke was the perfect example of why sentient life was a mistake. He was a creature of pure impulse, a man who tried to fix a leaking faucet by blowing up the dam. He has resurrected the ancestors of his species without providing them with metabolic support or cellular regeneration, the Supreme Arbiter noted, his eye stalks twitching with clinical disdain. He has created a population crisis and a biological anomaly in under 30 seconds. Proceed to the next phase of observation. The sterilization beams are at 60% capacity. Down in the Dog and Duck pub, Neil Clarke was living through a waking nightmare. The scratching at the door had intensified, and the windows were beginning to fog from the sudden, unnatural drop in temperature. Ray was still pinned against the bar by a mob of women whose devotion had crossed the line into predatory mania. "Neil, the door!" Ray screamed, ducking as a heavy brass lamp was accidentally knocked over by one of his admirers. "Do something about the dead people! And for the love of everything, make these women leave me alone!" Neil raised his hand, his face pale with sweat. Right. I wish Ray was just normal again. Just a regular, average guy. And I wish all the dead people, I wish they were back where they came from. But at the time they were there. Not now. Just go back to being dead, but peacefully. Snap. The silence that followed was deafening. The women in the pub blinked, the glassy-eyed obsession vanishing from their faces. They looked at Ray, then at each other, and then hurriedly began to smooth their clothes and exit the pub in a cloud of collective embarrassment. Outside, the scratching stopped. The millions of resurrected souls across the globe vanished into thin air, returning to the quiet of their graves. Neil slumped against a table, gasping for air. Okay, that's fixed. No more dead people. No more crazy love. You're forgetting the weather, Neil, Dennis remarked, trotting over to the window. The dog's voice was as calm and aristocratic as ever, despite the fact that frost was beginning to form on the inside of the glass. It's currently 12 degrees Celsius and dropping. I'm a terrier, not a husky. I demand a heated floor and perhaps a cashmere sweater. Neil looked out the window. The snow was falling in thick, heavy clumps. In his haste to stop global warming earlier, he had overcompensated. The planet's thermal equilibrium had been shattered. I can fix this, Neil whispered, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, desperate resolve. I need to do something big. Something that proves humans aren't just selfish. Something the Council, if they're out there, can't ignore. He walked to the center of the street, the cold biting through his thin cardigan. He raised his right hand high, the golden aura flaring with the intensity of a dying star. "I wish for world peace," Neil shouted into the storm. "And I wish for the Earth's climate to be perfectly balanced. No more global warming, no more freezing. Just perfect." A massive wave of golden energy erupted from his palm, a ring of light that expanded outward, crossing oceans and mountains in the blink of an eye. For a moment, Neil felt a surge of pure divine triumph. He had done it. He had saved the world. But as the light faded, the horror began to set in. Neil looked at him standing by a nearby bus stop. The man was frozen. He wasn't dead, but his arms were down at his sides, his face expressionless. He wasn't moving, wasn't speaking, wasn't even reacting to the snow. Neil ran to the next person, a woman walking her dog. She, too, was a statue. The dog sat perfectly still, its tail motionless. In his desire for world peace, Neil hadn't specified a peace of the heart or a diplomatic resolution. The power, in its literal and cold interpretation, had decided that the only way to ensure absolute peace was to remove the ability for any human to take action. The entire species had been placed in a state of living stasis. They were mannequins of flesh and bone, unable to harm each other because they were unable to move. "Well," Dennis said, his voice echoing in the eerie, silent street, "it's certainly quiet. No more sirens, no more shouting. Just a planet-sized library. Though I must say the lack of activity makes the prospect of a walk quite redundant." "I didn't mean this," Neil stammered, his breath coming in white plumes. The temperature had stabilized, but the world was a graveyard of the living. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by the roar of a heavy engine. A black armored SUV skidded around the corner, its tires screaming against the asphalt. It was the only thing moving in the city. It slammed to a halt, and Colonel Grant, Catherine's obsessed and hyper-militant ex-boyfriend, stepped out. He was holding a high-caliber military rifle, and his eyes were burning with a terrifying, singular focus. "Clarke!" Grant roared, leveling the weapon at Neil's chest. "I don't know what kind of chemical weapon you just deployed, but my men are down. The whole base is silent. You're coming with me, or I'm going to see if your miracles work on a hollow-point bullet." Neil raised his hand to defend himself, but his fingers were numb with cold and shock. Before he could speak a wish, the clouds above London began to swirl into a perfect, circular vortex. A beam of white, searing light descended from the heavens, locking onto Neil. The council had seen the peace he had created. They had seen the climate balance. And they had reached their verdict. "The subject has rendered the species inert," the Arbiter's voice boomed. Not in Neil's ears, but directly inside his skull. "The test is a failure. Planet Earth is scheduled for decommissioning in T-minus 60 minutes. The voice of the Supreme Arbiter did not just echo in Neil Clarke's mind. It vibrated through his very DNA, a cold, resonant frequency that felt like the tolling of a funeral bell for an entire species. High above the snow-choked streets of London, the Intergalactic Council had stopped being amused. To them, the peace Neil had created was the ultimate proof of human incompetence. A solution that turned a vibrant, if messy, biosphere into a silent museum of motionless meat. 59 minutes, the voice boomed, a cosmic whisper that rattled the windows of the silent city. At the conclusion of this hour, the solar system will be cleared for the construction of a trans-dimensional bypass. Your trial, Neil Clarke, is concluded. You have proven that even with the power of the source, a human can only produce stagnation and ruin. Neil stood in the middle of the road, his knees shaking. The blizzard he had accidentally summoned was beginning to die down as his climate balance wish took hold, but the cost was the absolute stillness of every human soul on Earth. Except for one. Colonel Grant stepped closer, the barrel of his rifle a cold, black eye staring directly at Neil's forehead. Grant was a man of action, a man who believed that power belonged to those with the strongest will and the biggest guns. He didn't care about alien voices or cosmic trials. He saw a man who had paralyzed his soldiers and turned the world into a tomb, and he wanted control. "I don't care about your arbiter, Clarke," Grant spat, his voice harsh in the unnatural silence. "I want my men awake. I want this peace undone, and I want you to give me that power. Now." Neil looked at Grant, then at the frozen pedestrians. The weight of the world felt like it was crushing his spine. "You don't understand," Neil whispered, his golden glowing finger twitching. "I'm trying to save us. I keep getting the words wrong." "Then get them right," Grant roared. Neil closed his eyes, drawing in a jagged, freezing breath. He had to undo the stasis. He had to show the council that humans deserved to live, even if they were loud, messy, and violent. I wish everyone was just normal again. No more stasis, no more frozen peace, just let everyone go back to exactly how they were before I made that stupid wish. Snap! The world exploded back into sound. The man at the bus stop finished his sneeze. The woman's dog began to bark. Cars honked, tires screeched, and the sudden roar of a city returning to life was almost deafening. But with the life came the chaos. People began to scream as they realized they were standing in deep snow in the middle of a London spring. The sudden shift in reality sent the city into a collective panic. Grant didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, swinging the butt of his rifle toward Neil's head. But Neil was faster. He didn't even think. He just waved his hand in a frantic defensive arc. I wish you were somewhere else. Somewhere you can't hurt anyone. Grant vanished in a cloud of blue sparks. He reappeared instantly in the middle of the Sahara Desert, still holding his rifle, screaming in fury at the burning sand. One down, Dennis remarked, shaking the snow off his fur. The dog's posh baritone was a small comfort in the escalating madness, though I suspect the colonel will be quite cross when he finds his way back. Also, Neil, the countdown is still ticking. If I'm to be vaporized, I'd really prefer to have had my teeth brushed first. Neil didn't answer. He turned and ran toward his school. If he was going to save the world, he needed to prove he could lead. He needed to prove he could use the power for something more than just domestic chores and accidental apocalypses. He burst into his classroom. The students were in a state of total rebellion. The disappearance from the day before had turned them into a mob of terrified, angry teenagers. They were throwing books, smashing desks, and chanting for answers. "Listen to me," Neil shouted, standing on his desk. He waved his hand. "I wish you all would just listen. I wish I was the most inspiring, incredible teacher you've ever had. I want you to love learning. I want you to be the best versions of yourselves." The effect was instantaneous. The students stopped. They sat down. Their eyes glazed over with a sudden, fanatical devotion to literature. They began to recite Shakespeare in unison, their voices flat and robotic. It wasn't inspiration, it was mind control. Neil stared at them, a sick feeling rising in his stomach. Every time he tried to do good, the power took the shortcut. It didn't inspire them, it rewrote them. He wasn't a teacher, he was a programmer, and he was making mistakes in every line of code. "This isn't right," he whispered, stepping down from the desk. "I can't just force them to be good." 45 minutes, the arbiter's voice reminded him, sounding almost bored. Neil sprinted out of the school and toward Catherine's office. He had to see her. She was the one thing in his life that felt real, the one thing he hadn't tried to fix with a wish yet. He found her in the middle of a chaotic newsroom, where journalists were frantically trying to report on the global stasis and the London blizzard. "Neil?" Catherine asked, looking up from her desk. She looked exhausted, her hair messy, her eyes wide with the stress of the day. "What are you doing here? The world is going mad." Neil looked at her, and for a moment, he forgot about the council, the countdown, and the talking dog. "Catherine, I have something to tell you. I have this power. I can do absolutely anything. I can make you the happiest woman in the world. I can make you love me." He raised his hand, the golden glow reflecting in her eyes. Catherine froze. She looked at his hand, then at his face. You do that? You'd just change how I feel?" "I could," Neil said, his voice trembling. "But I won't. I want you to choose me." But before Catherine could respond, the television screens in the newsroom flickered to life. It wasn't a news report. It was a transmission from the council. The screen showed a massive, pulsating energy weapon being aimed directly at the Earth's core. The subject has failed to utilize the power for anything beyond personal validation and clumsy social engineering, the arbiter announced to the entire world. "The sterilization process has been accelerated. You have 30 minutes remaining." The newsroom erupted in screams. Catherine looked at Neil, horror dawning on her face. "You did this? You're the one the voice is talking about?" "I can fix it," Neil yelled over the noise. "I just need more time." But as he reached out to her, the doors to the newsroom burst open. Colonel Grant had returned, and he wasn't alone. He had used a stolen transport to get back, and he was covered in desert sand, his eyes wild with a truly divine level of rage. "Clarke!" Grant screamed, leveling his rifle once more. If the world is ending in 30 minutes, I'm making sure you go first. Neil raised his hand, but his mind was a blur of panic. I wish I was somewhere safe, with Catherine and Dennis. The flash of light was the largest yet. When it cleared, Neil, Catherine, and Dennis were no longer in the newsroom. They were standing on the very edge of a massive, shimmering platform in the middle of space. Below them, planet Earth hung like a fragile blue marble. And standing before them, towering hundreds of feet into the star-flecked void, was the Council itself. The transition from a chaotic London newsroom to the heart of a deep space nebula was instantaneous. A sickening lurch of physics that left Neil Clarke gasping for air that shouldn't have been there. He clutched Catherine's hand, his fingers white-knuckled as he realized they were standing on a platform of pure, shimmering energy. Below them was nothing but the infinite star-flecked void. Above them, towering like skyscraper-sized nightmares, were the superior beings. "Neil, where are we? What is that?" Catherine shrieked, her voice echoing in a way that suggested the vacuum of space had been temporarily convinced to carry sound. She stared up at the Supreme Arbiter, a creature with a dozen undulating eyes and a body that seemed to be made of shifting, translucent jelly. "It's the Council," Neil whispered, his voice trembling. "They're the ones who gave me the power. They're the ones who are going to kill us." "Correction," the Arbiter's voice boomed, a sound that felt like a tectonic plate shifting inside their skulls. "We are the ones who are going to sterilize your sector. Killing implies a personal interest. This is merely a galactic renovation." Dennis, seemingly unbothered by the lack of gravity or the presence of cosmic deities, trotted to the edge of the platform and peered down at the Earth, which looked like a tiny, fragile marble below them. "I must say, the view is spectacular," the dog remarked, his velvet baritone echoing through the platform. "Though I'm disappointed the moon doesn't actually look like cheese. A minor failing of the creator, I suppose?" The Arbiter's eyes all focused on the dog. "You gave a beast the gift of reason," the alien hissed, a sound of static and disgust. "You used the source to converse with a creature that licks its own paws. You used it to animate your breakfast. You used it to create a piece that was indistinguishable from a morgue. You have proven that your species lacks the imagination for greatness and the wisdom for restraint." "I was trying," Neil shouted, stepping forward, his right hand glowing with a desperate golden intensity. "I didn't know the rules. You just dropped this on me. How was I supposed to know that world peace would turn everyone into statues? I'm just a teacher. I'm average." That was the point, wasn't it? The point. A second council member, a being made of jagged, floating crystals, interjected, "was to see if there was anything in your primitive DNA worth saving. We gave you the ability to do absolutely anything. You could have ended disease. You could have expanded your consciousness. You could have turned your planet into a paradise. Instead, you tried to make a woman love you and a dog talk." Catherine looked at Neil, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and dawning realization. "Neil? You tried to make me love you with a wish?" Neil felt a stab of shame deeper than any alien threat. "No, I thought about it. But I didn't do it, Catherine. I wanted it to be real. I wanted to be worthy of it." 20 minutes, the Arbiter announced, a giant holographic countdown appearing in the void. 1959, 1958. "We have seen enough. The subject is a failure. The species is a nuisance. Prepare the thermal kinetic pulse." "Wait!" Neil screamed, waving his hand in a wide, frantic arc. "I wish you would just listen. I wish I could show you that we're better than this. We make mistakes, yes, but we learn. We're messy, but we're alive." The golden energy flared, but for the first time it hit a wall. The council members didn't move. They didn't change. "You cannot use the source against its creators, little ape," the Arbiter sneered. "Your power is a loan, and the debt is now due." With a flick of a giant, translucent tentacle, the council sent a wave of force toward the platform. Neil, Catherine, and Dennis were thrown backward as the reality around them dissolved once more. In a flash of blinding white light, they were slammed back into the London newsroom. The transition was brutal. They hit the floor hard, the sounds of screaming journalists and the roar of the city outside returning like a physical blow. The countdown was still there, though, visible through the windows, projected onto the very fabric of the sky. 1500, 1459. "Neil!" Catherine gasped, grabbing his arm as she scrambled to her feet. "If you can do anything, save them. Not just me. Not just us. Save the world." But the newsroom doors were suddenly kicked open. Colonel Grant burst in, his face caked with desert sand, his military uniform tattered, and his mind clearly shattered by the events of the day. He wasn't alone. A squad of loyal, terrified soldiers followed him, their weapons raised. "No more talk!" Grant screamed, his eyes fixed on Neil's glowing hand. "The sky says we have 15 minutes. I'm taking that hand, Clarke. If I have to hack it off your body, I will. I'm the only one who can lead this planet." "Grant, stop!" Catherine yelled, stepping between them. "The aliens are going to destroy everything. We have to let Neil fix it." "Fix it?" Grant laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "He's the one who broke it. Move, Catherine, or you're collateral damage." Neil looked at his hand. He looked at the countdown in the sky. He looked at the man who wanted to be a tyrant and the woman who wanted him to be a hero. He realized then that as long as he had the power, he was the target. As long as he was the god, the council would only see his flaws. "I can't do it," Neil whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "Every time I wish for something, it goes wrong. I'm not the right person for this. I'm not smart enough. I'm not good enough." "Neil, look at me," Dennis said, his posh voice cutting through the tension of the room. The dog sat calmly amidst the pointed rifles and the screaming reporters. "You've spent your whole life being average, and you hate it. But being average is why they chose you. You're the only one who understands how much it hurts to be human. Now, stop being a martyr and start being a teacher. What's the one thing you've always told your students?" Neil blinked. A memory of a classroom, a messy, loud, wonderful classroom, flashed through his mind. "The only way to win a rigged game is to change the rules." A slow, determined smile spread across Neil's face. He looked at Grant, then at the sky, then at his hand. "I wish," Neil started, his voice growing steady. "Shoot him!" Grant roared. As the soldiers pulled their triggers, Neil waved his hand one last time. But he didn't wish for safety. He didn't wish for the aliens to leave. He made the only wish that could possibly save a species that didn't know how to save itself. The newsroom was a chaotic blur of motion. Colonel Grant's finger was already squeezing the trigger of his rifle, the firing pin swinging forward to ignite a bullet meant for Neil Clarke's skull. Time seemed to slow to a crawl, the air thick with the smell of ozone and the heavy, rhythmic thrumming of the countdown in the sky. 0:15, 0:14. Neil didn't wave his hand to stop the bullets. He didn't wish for Grant to vanish. He realized in a moment of pure, unadulterated clarity that the power was a poison that no human was meant to swallow. We are too complicated, too selfish, and too full of contradictions. To save the world, he had to give it away. "I wish," Neil roared, his right hand flaring with a golden light so bright it blinded everyone in the room. "I wish for the power to be given to someone truly worthy. I wish the power belonged to Dennis." Snap. The golden aura didn't fade. It migrated. It flowed out of Neil's fingertips like liquid sun, coiling through the air and slamming into the scruffy, unimpressed terrier sitting on the floor. The bullets from Grant's rifle hit a shimmering, impenetrable golden dome that had instantly formed around the dog. The lead flattened like pancakes and dropped harmlessly to the carpet. The soldiers froze, their weapons suddenly feeling like toys in the presence of a true sovereign. High above the atmosphere, the Intergalactic Council's sensors went into a state of total catastrophic failure. "Biological anomaly detected!" the crystal being shrieked. "The source has moved. It is no longer with the biped. It has integrated with a quadrupedal scavenger." The Supreme Arbiter's dozen eyes widened in genuine celestial terror. "A canine? You gave the architecture of reality to a beast that chases its own tail?" On Earth, Dennis stood up. He didn't look like a god. He still looked like a dog that needed a bath, but his eyes were swirling galaxies of golden energy. He looked at the screaming Colonel Grant, then at the terrified journalist, and finally he looked up through the ceiling, straight at the council, hiding in the stars. "Well," Dennis said, his velvet baritone echoing across every television screen and radio frequency on the planet. "I've spent the last 24 hours listening to humans talk about peace and power and love. It's all very exhausting, but I know what I want. And unlike my owner, I don't overthink things." "Dennis, wait!" Neil gasped, reaching out. "Think about the consequences." "I am thinking, Neil," Dennis replied, a canine smirk playing across his muzzle. "I'm thinking about the fact that those colorful gentlemen in the sky want to turn my favorite park into a bypass. And I'm thinking that the only thing worse than a human with power is an alien with an ego." The council didn't wait. "Fire the sterilization beam!" the Arbiter roared. "Destroy the planet before the beast can speak." A massive, world-ending pulse of purple energy erupted from the alien flagship, screaming down toward Earth's core. It was enough to turn the planet into a cloud of drifting gas in a microsecond. Dennis didn't even bark. He simply sat down and tilted his head. "I wish," Dennis whispered, his voice heard by every living thing in the galaxy, "that the Council and their entire fleet were just gone. Blown up. And I wish everything on Earth went back to exactly how it was before this whole mess started. Except for one thing. The golden light exploded. It didn't just counter the alien beam, it swallowed it. In the void of space, the Council members had just enough time to feel a sudden, intense annoyance protocol from the universe itself before their flagship vanished in a silent, brilliant supernova of golden dust. The threat to Earth didn't just stop, it was erased from history. Snap. The newsroom was silent. The countdown was gone. The snow in the streets vanished, replaced by the damp, gray London spring. The resurrected ancestors returned to their peace. The soldiers looked at their empty hands, their weapons having turned into harmless bouquets of daisies. Colonel Grant blinked, looking around in confusion before wandering out of the room, his mind having been reset to a state of harmless, bewildered docility. Neil looked at his hand. The glow was gone. He felt light. He felt average. He felt wonderful. He looked at Catherine, who was staring at him with an expression that wasn't forced by a wish or a spell. It was just her. She whispered. "Did we just win?" "I think the dog won," Neil said, leaning down to pet Dennis. Dennis was no longer glowing. The power was gone, returned to the void from which it came. But the dog looked up at Neil, his tail wagging with a slow, rhythmic thud. "You said except for one thing, Dennis," Neil whispered. "What was the one thing?" Dennis licked his nose and looked toward the kitchen, where a fresh, high-end prime rib steak was suddenly sitting on a silver platter on the floor. "I'm a god of my word, Neil," Dennis remarked, trotting toward his meal. "I kept the voice. Being able to explain exactly why I'm ignoring you is a luxury I simply couldn't give up. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a date with a piece of beef and then a very long nap on your favorite sweater." Neil laughed, pulling Catherine close. The galaxy was a big, dangerous, and judgmental place, but for now, the safety hazards of Earth were safe. They had survived the ultimate test, not by being perfect, but by being just human enough to know when to let go. High above, where the Council used to be, a single golden spark remained. A lingering reminder that the universe was watching. And somewhere in the back row of the cosmos, the humans were finally getting some respect.